how you define consciousness matters here, but
Yes.
plants are conscious. They're aware of their environment. They have senses. They're not like our senses,
Right.
but they're picking up on chemicals in the air and in the soil and light in very specific ways, and they're reacting, not just instinctually, but appropriately.
You had this weird feeling of them having much more sensitivity than you imagined.
The world as we perceive it is dependent on the particular senses we have. Other creatures have a different set of senses, and therefore they live in a different world. So the bee, for example, can see ultraviolet light we can't see. If you could get inside a bee's head, the world would look very different, and you'd see patterns like landing markings on flowers in ultraviolet colors that they can see that you've never seen before.
Human beings are so constituted that periodically they seek out ecstasis, a stepping outside the norm. We make a point of seeking out these experiences that touch us deeply within and lift us momentarily beyond ourselves. At such times, we feel that we inhabit our humanity more fully than usual and experience an enhancement of being.
Hey class, welcome to week 2. This week we're going to talk about the origin of religion and actually dig into who we are as human beings and why we have religious experiences. From an evolutionary perspective, we have to realize that humans actually had something like religion long before there was the Bible or the Quran or the Upanishads or any other religious text. And also from an evolutionary perspective, we have to recognize that there was some point at which our ancestors had no religion at all. So when did we start having religion, and what did that religion look like? We have rock art, we have etchings, we have small figurines, and we also have cave paintings. In our first reading for this week, we're going to follow Karen Armstrong deep into one of these caves, and she's going to unveil the latest research on what we think our ancestors were doing in those caves and the beliefs and practices that might have made up their religion. Then we're going to go back even farther, way beyond 30,000 years, and look at the origin of morality. A lot of times we think religion and morality are tightly interwound, but recent research is showing that morality probably predated religion by quite a bit. You've probably already noticed a basic sense of morality in your pets or in other animals, and in primates, that sense of morality is even more developed. So we see capuchin monkeys protesting when things just aren't fair. There's like a basic sense of justice there. And taking it even further, we start to see that humans seem to have innate moral taste, you might say. And this all comes from a really interesting field called moral foundations theory. We're going to dive into that in the second set of materials this week. Third, we're going to look deeper into the religious experience. The first thing to note about the religious experience is that it's everywhere. It feels like a loss of self. You feel a sense of oneness with the world around you or the people around you. And that sense of a bond that you can have with the people around you may actually have an evolutionary advantage. These religious experiences can be brought about by coming together in large groups, dancing, drumming, or using drugs. Which brings us to number 4. Our ancestors may have been stoned or high on a regular basis. And this is the foundation for another interesting theory from Terence McKenna. McKenna came up with this idea of the stoned ape theory. The stoned ape theory suggests that the cognitive and cultural revolution that we've seen over the last 500,000 years or so, in which our brains expanded tremendously, language developed, and our symbolic capacities developed, may have been brought about by our ancestors walking out on the savannah and picking up magic mushrooms. Sounds crazy, but...
Now think of this. Our primate ancestors are going across the savannah. They ingest these mushrooms as a clan. Massive input for anyone who's eaten these mushrooms. Huge amounts of data is coming in. Fractal patterns, geometrical, landscapes occur.
Number 5, shamanism was probably the world's first religion. This is what Karen Armstrong suggests is happening inside those caves. And the evidence for this is pretty strong. So the evidence we have is that by 30,000 years ago, we see these cave paintings all over the world. And what's interesting is that a lot of these cave paintings have certain geometric patterns. The same symbols show up all over the world. And those symbols seem to be representations of entoptic phenomena. Entoptic phenomena are things you can see with your eyes, even in total sensory deprivation. It has something to do with the biology of our eyes and the ways that our brain tries to see patterns where there's maybe absolute nothingness or just the basic inputs from the biology of our eyes themselves. These entoptic phenomena are often experienced in trance or during a religious experience. And as a final piece of evidence, we've actually seen shamans among the San of South Africa, as well as the Tucano in South America, actually drawing these patterns while they're in trance. So based on this, it actually seems reasonable that those paintings we see in those caves were actually made by people who were in trance or possibly having some sort of religious experience. Which brings us to number 6. Shamans are experts in the religious experience. So we have some great readings here from Jeremy Narby. First, he's going to explore how Westerners have seen shamans over the last 500 years and how our vision of shamans has changed. And then he's going to take us into the Amazon to talk about his own shamanic journey, where he worked with shamans in the Amazon, and they tell him something interesting. He's actually there to study plants and the amazing knowledge that these Amazonians have. What surprises him is that when he asks people, how do you know so much about these plants, they keep saying, the plants told us. And specifically, they tell them when they're in trance, which is brought about through the use of ayahuasca. So they eventually tell him, you have to try ayahuasca to really learn about this. And so he does, and he completely changes his ideas about what plants are all about and whether or not they have consciousness. Which brings us to point 7. One of the key things about shamanism is that shamans say that they enter this other world where they can actually communicate with plants and animals around them. And this, again, sounds really radical, but what's really curious about it is that as anthropologists and other people started practicing shamanism themselves and going into trance, they were having the same experiences. So these were often like very hyper-rationalistic Westerners, very keen on science, and suddenly having these intense experiences, feeling like a presence among plants and animals and so on. They started to think like maybe these shamans are actually revealing some real experience. This isn't just them making stuff up. That leads us to number 8. Plants are actually a lot more conscious than most people think. Now, I know we're starting to get into some really radical territory here, and it might sound like I've gone off the deep end and I've done a little too much ayahuasca myself. Maybe as a side note, I should say I've actually never done any drugs. I haven't even tasted alcohol. That's a little strange, I know. I've never done any of this stuff. And yet I find it very compelling, this idea of plant consciousness. And what you'll notice in this part of the week's material is that when you look at plants in human time, they don't look very alive. They certainly don't appear to be conscious. But when you speed things up and you look at plants in time lapse, you start to see things very differently. And you can almost recognize that our sense of time is actually human-centered. And if you could somehow step outside of that and see everything sped up, what you would see is plants fighting for the light, fighting for resources.
And they're competing for the same pole. And one of them gets the edge and is growing a little bit more quickly. And as soon as it makes contact, the other one seems to lose heart.
It just looks really sad. I have to admit, the first time I saw that video, I nearly cried. It was like an epiphany. So I'm really excited for you to see that and to start thinking differently about plant consciousness and even about our own consciousness. One of the key themes of this class is going to be to think about what consciousness really is. A lot of people who have these religious experiences say that they actually think consciousness is just all around us, and that in fact our consciousness is like a reducing valve, limiting us from the vast consciousness that's out there, and that we could be a part of if we could just let go of the ego. Again, these are sort of out there ideas, but these are important ideas as we get into other religions, and we're going to have to expand our notions of consciousness in order to understand how other religions are looking at consciousness. So what is actually happening during a religious experience? When we look at brain scans of people going through a religious experience, often drug-induced for the purpose of these scientific experiments, we see that while certainly the brain does light up like fireworks, like you would expect, because certainly the experience is full of fireworks, we actually see a reduction of activity in the default mode network. The default mode network is like the superhighway that's been created in your brain through the habitual connections that you've made throughout your life, ruminating, reflecting on yourself, and worrying about the future, all those things that basically make up the ego. What happens during a religious experience is that default mode network goes quiet, and suddenly all new types of connections are possible, and your ego's not there to get in the way. So that all sounds really great, right? Transform your consciousness, let's go for it. So, let's just all go get some DMT and go for it. Fortunately, some anthropologists like Michael Harner, who've been studying shamanism for many decades, have found that there are many ways to access the religious experience that don't necessarily require drugs. So your activity this week will actually be to try to quiet your default mode network and have something like a religious experience. You'll have 3 options for this. Option number 1 will be to use Michael Harner's technique, which he's developed from shamans all over the world. Number 2 will be to just go to a rave or a concert or some sort of event that can allow you to experience what Durkheim called collective effervescence, this sense of oneness with the people around you. And option number 3 is kind of the Western way of doing this. It comes to us from the Anxiety Guy, who describes how to quiet your default mode network through a combination of journaling and something like meditation. So that's what we have for week 2. I'm super excited. Download the materials below. I've got all of the MP3s there. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the discussions.
Are we blocking off these constant frequencies that are around us? So this experience that's around us, it is our own ego or our own mortality, our own desire to stay alive and protect ourselves, or whatever the various blockades that we put up, are those diminished by psilocybin that allows this ever-present experience to manifest itself?
It's exactly right. The most interesting scientific finding of this current generation of research is that when they image the brains of people on psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca, they expected to see fireworks, right? Lots of activity, because the experience has lots of fireworks. But they found something that they didn't expect, which was a diminishment of activity in a very important brain network called the default mode network.